Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating balancing act in the world of technology, the tension between regulation and innovation. And we're going to do it by looking at the EU's brand new AI Act. Now, this analysis was conducted under the scientific supervision of Professor Vihar Kiskinov, and it gets right to the heart of a huge debate.
So here's the central question, the big one that lawmakers are wrestling with all over the world. How do you put guardrails on powerful AI to keep people safe without burying the small, innovative startups under a mountain of compliance costs that only the tech giants can afford? It's a real tightrope walk between safety and speed. And the European Union's attempt to solve this puzzle, well, it all comes down to a single critical piece of the legislation, Article 63. You can think of it as a special carve-out, a rule specifically designed to give the little guys, the small innovators, a real fighting chance.
To really get what Article 63 is all about, we have to follow its journey. We'll start with the basic problem it's trying to solve. Then we'll look at the first idea they had, a simple exemption. We'll see how they had to close some pretty big loopholes, how their whole strategy shifted, and finally, we'll cover the core rules that nobody gets to break.
All right, first up, the innovator's dilemma. For a startup, moving fast isn't just a goal, it's a matter of survival. But for regulators, public safety is everything. These two priorities are constantly pulling in opposite directions, and Article 63 is the attempt to find that sweet spot right in the middle.
So, what was the first shot at solving this? Well, the initial idea was about as straightforward as you can get. Just let the smallest companies skip some of the toughest rules altogether. This timeline really maps out the whole story. We're going to start way back in June of 2022. As you can see, the first idea was pretty simple, but boy did things get a lot more complicated very quickly. The original proposal was a complete pass on something called a quality management system, or a QMS. Now, a QMS isn't a small thing. It's a huge, documented framework that covers every single part of an AI's life. For a tiny team of, say, 5 people, building that is an absolutely massive burden. So the thinking was, hey, let's just take that obstacle off the table for them.
So who exactly are we talking about here? In the eyes of the law, these small innovators are called microenterprises, and the definition is super specific. It's a 2-part test, and you have to pass both. First, you need fewer than 10 employees. And second, your annual turnover has to be less than 2 million euros. It's not one or the other, it's both.
Okay, but you can probably see the problem coming. This super simple exemption had a giant, gaping loophole, and lawmakers spotted it almost right away.
And this was the exact question that changed everything. I mean, what's to stop a massive tech company from just spinning up a little 9-person subsidiary, pumping it full of cash, and using it to develop high-risk AI while totally dodging the safety rules? It would have made the entire law pointless. So the solution, which came along in November 2022, was this new 2-part test. It wasn't enough to just be small anymore. You now also had to be truly independent. The second part, this no partner or linked enterprises clause, is the real key. It's the check to make sure you're not secretly being controlled or propped up by a bigger company. But then, something really interesting happened in early 2024. The whole philosophy behind the rule changed. It seems like lawmakers decided that a full exemption, even a conditional one, was just too risky. The answer wasn't to let small companies off the hook, but to give them a different, more manageable hook to work with. And this slide just lays out that pivot perfectly. The entire idea of a full exemption got thrown out and replaced with something called simplified compliance. So instead of getting a pass, small companies now get a special pathway. The end goal, a safe AI system, is exactly the same, but the road to get there is designed for a team with limited resources. Honestly, it's a much smarter way to regulate because it focuses on the outcome, not just one rigid process. So the main thing to remember here is that the administrative weight is lifted, but the level of protection for people is not. The EU Commission's job is now to create practical guides, things like templates, checklists, to show these small companies exactly how they can meet those high standards in a much more streamlined way. And that brings us to maybe the most important part of the final rule. Even with this simplified path, there are some things you just can't simplify. There's what you might call a hard floor of compliance that absolutely everyone has to meet, no matter how small they are. Yeah, and this is the core message. A simpler process does not mean you get a free pass. The fundamental duties you have when you're building potentially high-risk AI, those still apply, 100%. So what does this hard floor look like? Well, the law is very clear.
every single high-risk AI provider must have a solid risk management system. You have to think through what could go wrong. You need proper data governance to make sure your data is high quality and not biased. You have to keep detailed technical documents and logs, so if something goes wrong, investigators can see what happened. You have to build in transparency and make sure a human can always step in. And of course, your system has to be accurate, robust, and secure against cyber attacks. And even after it's launched, you have to keep an eye on it. These are really the pillars of trustworthy AI.
And this quote, which comes directly from Article 63 itself, just says it all. You can simplify the process, but you cannot affect the level of protection. That's the bottom line.
So, to wrap up the whole story, this table lays it all out pretty clearly. We started with a full, no-strings-attached exemption back in 2022. That shifted to a conditional exemption to close that big loophole. And we finally landed on the much more nuanced approach we have today. Simplified compliance, but still with that critical condition that you have to be truly independent.
And so that leaves us with the big open question. You know, on paper, this looks like a really clever compromise. The EU moved from a sledgehammer to a scalpel. But in the real world, is that unbreakable floor of compliance still too high? Is it still too complicated, too expensive for that 9-person startup to clear? That's the billion-dollar question, and we're all going to be watching to see how it plays out.